today's talk is based on a recent article of mine that was published in 2025 in a Brepels volume titled Filosofia e Medicina in Italia fra Medioevo e Prima Età Moderna. And it ideally continues the work done in a 2019 booklet of mine, alas, written in Italian, on twins in the Middle Ages. In this book, I had not considered the mention of twins in Cecco d'Ascoli and Dante Alighieri, nor their use to discuss the theme of nobility and bona nativitas, simply because I didn't find these special twins in Dante and Cecco when I was writing my book. So that's why I decided to talk about them now. Let's start with slide number 3. So Cecco d'Ascoli is the popular name of Francesco Stabili, a prominent Italian physician, astrologer, and poet. His most famous work, as everybody knows, setting aside his important commentary on John of Hollywood's Sphere, his important work is definitely the Acerba, an encyclopedia of scientific erudition written in Italian vernacular poetic verses. It consists of 4 books in 6-line stanzas, and will later be known as the Anti-Commedia, in reference to Dante's comedy. Historiography will later define Cecco himself as an anti-Dante. The book, The Acerba, was translated into English by Diane Murphy in 2015 with the title The Bitter Age. However, acerba or acerba etas is perhaps better rendered as unripe, the unripe age. However, we have an English translation of this wonderful book. Next slide. Among the many places in which in the Acerba, where Cecco d'Ascoli marks the distance between himself and Dante, there are his words relative to nobility. In chapter 12 of book 2, Cecco shows that he knows Dante's view as set out in Le dolci rime d'amore ch'io solia, a famous canzone by Dante. First, I will read Murphy's translation and then my own, in this case, because it is more faithful to the Italian verses. I think that a literal translation better captures Cecco's intentions here. So, provate cieli la vostra chiarezza e correggete di questi l'errore che falsamente appellan gentilezza. Fu già trattato con le dolci rime e definito il nobile valore dal fiorentino con l'antiche lime. So provate means prove you heavens and not rain down, but it's okay. Maybe she had another text with the word piovete cieli, I'm not sure. Rain down you heavens is also a quotation, biblical quotation. However, the Italian text reads, prove you heavens, in my own translation, your clarity and correct the error of those who falsely define what nobility is. Nobility has already been addressed and defined with tender rhymes by the Florentine with the ancient files. So my translation clearly maintains the clear reference to Dante's canzone, because Dante's canzone is titled Le dolci rime d'amor ch'io solia, the tender rhymes of love I once sought out within my thoughts. This is the English translation. So it is very likely that Cecco did not know the 4th treatise of the Banquet by Dante, Il Convivio, which is devoted precisely to a commentary on Le dolci rime. Still, this canzone, Le dolci rime, could have offered Cecco a glimpse, however incomplete, of Dante's interpretation of nobility. Not only that, in the same chapter, and the text, you'll find the text in the next slide, Cecco claims that Dante, before heading to Ravenna, asked in letter his views on this theme. This slide is just the following verses by Cecco, in which he specifies his idea of nobility as the form of virtue found in deserving people when the heavens have a good disposition. Blood lineage is dismissed by Cecco, but I would like to skip to the next slide. I'm sorry. Dante wrote to me, expressing doubt. I know of 2 children born as twins, but the first is nobler than the second. You've seen this phenomenon before. This is Murphy's translation. I'm returning to Ravenna to stay there. Let me know, Ascolano, that is Cecco of Ascoli, what you think. So it is very doubtful, actually, whether this epistolary exchange took ever place. Piron and Coccia think it never happened. Indeed, Cecco faked an imaginary epistolary dialogue that never took place. Nevertheless, Dante's hypothetical request can be taken as an index not only of the relevance of the question of nobility, but also more generally of the role this question plays at the intersection of medicine and philosophy. Both in Dante and in Cecco, the theme of nobility is in fact intertwined with many other issues which touch on embryology, astrology, physiognomy, and ethics. A point of particular interest, which in turn brings together and unites all the disciplines I just mentioned, is the reference to twin, son 2 figliuoli nati in uno parto, which in the Middle Ages, as in our own days, often represented a theoretical laboratory for testing out a whole series of medical and philosophical doctrines. For example, in my booklet, Italian booklet on twins, I touched upon the use of twins in discussions about the relation between nature and grace, or in dismissing astrological claims, and this is the case of Augustine, or the use of conjoined twins in scholastic debates to talk about the unicity of or plurality of substantial forms. As well, in the twins are also used in debates on teratology, normality and abnormality in medical and natural philosophy. But today, let's get back on nobility with the next 2 slides, slide 7 and slide 8. Dante and Cecco are not, of course, the only ones to connect nobility with reproduction and birth, and in a broader sense with embryology, of course, because the connection for one is self-evident. If nobiles are bene nati, well born, it is clear that to understand nobility, one must investigate the conditions of bona nativitas, good birth. Then, too, if nobility is understood in a dynastic sense, according to the Vulgata, the common opinion, it remains to be understood how a given hereditary line of nobility comes into existence, and likewise how a noble individual can be born of non-noble parents. The theoretical concern that unites Cecco and Dante is precisely, for both of them, the desire to show that nobility is always essentially an individual phenomenon. It can occur at any time. It is not at all necessary that a nobleman is generated from noble parents, just as it is not at all obvious that a nobleman inevitably has noble children. The permeability, or we might say the fluidity of the boundaries between nobles and non-nobles upsets, naturally enough, those who define the idea of nobility of lineage. But as Dante masterfully explains into this text that you can read, and also in the following text passages of slide 9, these passages are taken both from the 4th treatise of the Banquet. Dante denied the possibility, as Dante explains, to deny the possibility of a passage from those who are not noble to those who are, or from those who are noble to those who are not, vice versa, would mean denying the very possibility of nobility. Because if nobility never begins, then all men, insofar as they descend from the same progenitors, are equally noble. And for Dante, the only way around this would be to concede that different species, the noble and the non-noble, coexist in humanity, and that these do not have the same common origin. But these, to think of two species from the beginning of times, the noble on one side and the non-nobles on the other, is obviously manifestly heretical, and not only in Aristotelian terms, explain Dante, but also according to Christian faith, because we all descend from Adam. How then can nobles be generated from ignobles or vile people? So before Dante and Cecco, the question appears, for example, to make just one example, I could do countless examples in the tradition of the commentaries on the pseudo-Aristotelian physiognomy, in the discussions of the Artiste, so scholastic debates at the Faculty of Arts, especially in the 13th century, and also in theological works. So in the next slide 10, you find just one example of a theologian using the same or discussing the same argument. For example, Henry of Ghent, in Quaestio 18 of his Quodlibet 9, asks himself whether nobility originally proceeded from ignobility. And he, to sum up his conclusions, distinguishes between two senses of the word nobilitas. The correct one, the nobilitas secundum naturam rei, and the popular meaning, the nobilitas secundum quam vulgo, so the vulgar meaning, vulgo solent appellari nobiles. In both cases, let's say, especially the real meaning must, in the real meaning, the transition from nobility and non-nobility, and vice versa, must be taken for granted. However, in discussing these options, Henry strongly appeals, as we can see from the next slide, to embryology and the conditions of conception, and in particular to the role of the virtus imaginativa in the transmission of nobility in this case. I want to go on and skip to Dante and then to Cecco, but however, these two slides with the text by Henry of Ghent simply are simply example just to point out that also in the theological tradition, and not only in the medical and in the philosophical tradition, the connection between nobility and embryology is very strong. And I just want to point out Henry's biblical reference at the end of this slide, the underlined text. This is a very famous quotation taken from a very famous reference taken from Genesis 37, line 37, 43, where we are told how Jacob appropriated a large part of his miserly father-in-law's flock, Laban's flock, basically by tricking Laban, by influencing the imagination of these animals, placing a series of sticks or rods near the watering place where these animals went uh, to drink at the time of mating, thus changing the color of the kids' coats before they were born in the sheep's wombs. Um, this is just one striking example showing how common the reference to embryology in relation to nobility was in the medieval tradition, not only the medical and the philosophical tradition, but also in the theological tradition. It is therefore hardly surprising that at the beginning of the 14th century, both Dante and Cecco have embryological, medical, and physiognomic assumptions around nobility. Next slide, and this is just a title of this section. Thank you. So as far as Dante is concerned, the answer to the question on the genesis of nobility is substantially based on the Aristotelian theory of reproduction. According to the well-known real, he calls it real definition of nobility, provided the definition is provided in chapter 20 of the fourth treatise of the Banquet, nobility is a seme di felicitate, a seed of happiness placed by God in the well-disposed soul, that is, whose body, the soul whose body is perfectly disposed in every part. So the definition refers theologically to a divine gift, which in turn presupposes a natural basis of preparation. The noble soul is one that receives this special gift from God insofar as the relative body is perfectly disposed. A well-disposed body is one which, as a result of the conditions associated with the reproduction and development of the embryo, enjoys optimal complexion. So after having quickly recalled the main opinions about the origin of human souls, Dante reproposes what he presumes to be the doctrine of Aristotle about this matter. Slide 15. Therefore, I say that when the seed of man falls into its receptacle, namely the matrix, the womb, it carries with it the virtue of the generative soul and the virtue of heaven and the virtue of the combined elements, namely the complexion. Here Dante is referring to the complexion of the seed. It matures and disposes the material to receive the formative virtue given by the soul of the generator, the soul of the father, and the formative virtue prepares the organs to receive the celestial virtue, which brings the soul from the potentiality of the seed into life. And the text goes on, as soon in the next slide as it is produced, it receives from the virtue of the celestial mover the possible intellect, which draws it into itself in potentiality all of the universal forms as they are found in its maker, to an ever lesser degree, the more it is removed from the primal intelligence. So if we now go back to slide to the previous slide for a while, we can better understand what Dante wants to clarify. This brief embryological description moves from some typically Aristotelian presuppositions, such as the clear division between the active role of the male semen and the merely material and passive role of the female principle. And then, of course, the female is also a vessel for the fetus. So active role of the male semen, passive role of the female principle, that is menstrual blood. And then another Aristotelian presupposition is the idea that the seed itself is the vehicle to the formative power derived from the paternal soul. But In this Aristotelian theory of generation, so to speak, there are also grafted on elements, and these are heterogeneous, but not really foreign to the Arab and Latin Aristotelian tradition. For example, the astral influence at the moment of conception, and most importantly, the doctrine of the direct infusion by God of the potential intellect, that is, of the rational soul. This infusion takes place as soon as the soul, which provides for the vegetative and sensitive functions, is formed naturally. What we might term as the physiological basis of nobility is thus constituted by three factors. The three factors I've underlined in this slide: the virtue of the generative soul, which comes from the paternal soul, the virtue of heaven, and finally the virtue of the combined elements, that is, the complexion of the seed, which helps define the complexion of the new individual. Once female matter has been prepared by the seed and by its complexion, the formative power creates organs that, on the basis of the famous Aristotelian definition of the soul in the second book of the Anima, of the book of the soul, represent the organs represent a fundamental requirement for life. The soul is, for Aristotle, the act of the organic body that possesses life in potentiality. As for the virtue of the heaven, the virtù del cielo, its sense is somewhat ambiguous, or at least uncipital, because on the one hand, it referred to the astral influence at the moment of conception, but on the other, it is, according to Dante, something that is brought with it by the seed, and that is therefore intrinsic to the seed. However, this idea is already double-edged in the Aristotelian tradition, that is astral influence, yes, but both at the moment of conception and within the seed. In fact, in the second book of the Generation of Animals, Aristotle notoriously alludes to the presence in the seed of all living things of a heat, unlike fire, that is instead analogous. He specifies analogous, is not the same thing, but analogous to the element of which the celestial bodies are made. In the next slide, you find my attempt to schematize the roles of the various features at play, and we can go back to the slide maybe later. But Dante refers not only to Aristotle, of course, but also to, as we all know, Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great, because also Albert the Great had already coupled this simple analogical correspondence of the heat, natural heat, and the celestial bodies to the idea, probably borrowed from Avicenna, of a direct role for astral influences in the development of the embryo. For example, he did so, Albert, in question 35 of the Problemata Determinata, but we can skip and we can sum up and simply saying that Albert aligns himself with a tradition that goes back at least to the 18th book of Avicenna's De Animalibus, and even farther upstream to Ptolemy's Quadripartitum. Celestial influences, Albert believes, together with many, can alter the development of the embryo. And in this way, the original quality of the seed is modified. The link between the virtus formativa, the formative virtue of the seed, and astral influences can indeed also be found in many, many other medieval sources. And of course, it's not useful to quote all these sources, also physiognomic sources. And we can go back to Dante with the next slide. In Dante, as we have already seen, the factors involved in the development of the embryo are only three. The presence, the reference to these presuppositions allows that we mentioned them already: the complexion of the seed, the astral influence, etc. But we have seen that the reference to these presuppositions allows us to establish a very strong and double consequential link. The quality of the soul, which is produced naturally in the embryo, depends on the quality of the bodily complexion. The body d'ogni parte disposto perfettamente, perfectly disposed in every part, and in its turn, the quality of the possible intellect, that is the rational soul, directly infused by God in each embryo or fetus, depends on the quality of the soul which is produced naturally in the embryo. Since the temperament, I'm reading Dante, of the seed may be more or less good, it's pretty clear, and the disposition of the sower may be, that is the father, may be more or less good, and the disposition of heaven for the effect may be good, better, or best, in accordance with the constellations which undergo continuous change, it comes to pass that a soul is created more or less pure from the seed of man and from these virtues. According to its purity, the possible intellectual virtue mentioned above descends into it in the manner mentioned, according to its purity. So in this way, Dante gives this embryology, which in its outline is Aristotelian, peripatetic, also a strikingly Neoplatonic twist. And we can read in the next slide. And if it happens that because of the purity of the recipient soul, the intellectual virtue is quite free of and withdrawn from every bodily darkness, the divine goodness increases in it as in a substance suited to receive it. Hence, it increases this intelligence in the soul according to its capacity for receiving it. So the disposition is very important, the material disposition. This is that seed of happiness of which we are presently speaking. Nobility is therefore for Dante the effect of this multiplication, we might say, of divine goodness that takes place in the well-disposed soul to the extent that it is well-disposed. Secondo che ricevere puote, according to the disposition to receive. The divine gift is thus inescapably proportionate to natural predisposition and eventually to embryological predisposition, so to the embryological predisposition of the receiver. Next slide. According to the principles of theology, it may be said that when the supreme deity, that is God, sees his creature prepared to receive his benefaction, he endows it with as great a gift as it is prepared to receive. We find here the same idea. Dante insists on this inseparable link between the bodily or natural conditions that give rise to the natural diversity of souls, which in turn has repercussions on the rational souls infused directly by God, and thus on their respective degrees of nobility. And to conclude this Dante's part of my talk, it is worth flagging up that the fourth treatise of the Banquet, Convivio, concludes with a long physiognomical section dedicated to the analysis of the science of nobility in the various phases of human life, the physical, of course, physiognomical science. And this is not surprising if one considers that medieval physiognomy constitutes a discipline elaborated with nobles in mind, and that physiognomy itself was increasingly incorporated into mainstream medicine. Then, of course, Dante takes up some of these themes, embryological themes, in the very famous speech of Statius in Canto 25 of the Purgatory. And there are some minor differences between the Banquet and Purgatory 25 on this very subject, but we won't discuss them now. Maybe we can talk about them later, as there is not enough time. However, in both cases, both in the Banquet and in the very famous this embryological description of Purgatory 25, the theory of reproduction and the embryology to which Dante appeals are, as already mentioned, fundamentally Aristotelian. The elements proper to the medical tradition are not entirely lacking, but they are in general subordinated to the philosophical approach. And that's why I don't want to indulge in the next slide, and we can go to the next section, section number 3, nobility and astrology. Let us now consider Cecco's position. Some elements in the analysis of nobility are shared by Cecco and Dante. Above all, there is in both of them, as I said already, the rejection of nobility of blood or lineage, and the denial of any connection between wealth and nobility. But beyond these shared points, Cecco's interpretation takes, though, a very, in my opinion, different path. In the first place, nobility is for Cecco, in a more traditional sense, a virtue or the form of virtue, rather than a divine gift or a seed of happiness, which coincide in Dante with the root of virtues, as discussed in the Banquet. Therefore, nobility is not the root of or seed of virtue for Cecco, but then the picture of the conditions or causes of nobility is in Cecco, we might say, strongly simplified with respect to Dante, and is indeed substantially mono causal. There is only one cause. Indeed, instead of the three factors evoked by Dante in the Banquet as natural prerequisites, prerequisites to which the divine gift is added, we find in Cecco only a reference to the astrological component. And that's, of course, that Cecco, you might say, is an astrologer. Thus the heavens with tranquil light predispose human beings to nobility and give us the free will to act on it. It's always the Murphy's translation. The second sphere sends down rays that are the very image of gentility, reflecting its virtue onto the world. Next slide. If this circle is again astrological, the cause also in the text, in this the continuation of Cecco's stanza, if this circle is conjoined with another whose light shines on noble lineages, it favors the birth of a fine gentleman. But star's influence on bloodlines doesn't always grant the same heritage as in the past. I demonstrated this above. So nobility or gentilezza depends for Cecco on celestial influence, and indeed on the influence of a particular heaven. And this is interesting, that is the second. But it's confusing, because if one were to follow the classical ascending order of the heavens as in the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology, the second heaven should be that of Mercury, which has little to do in the astrological tradition with nobility. The reference is perhaps then best understood in descending order. This is another hypothesis. And in that case, the second heaven after the crystalline would obviously be that of the fixed star, so and the zodiac. This is another possibility that I don't like. Another possibility, the third one, which is my favorite, of course, it's just an idea of mine, is that Cecco refers not to the order of the spheres per se, but to that of the influence of the planets on the unborn child during the 9 months of gestation. He would do so according to a tradition of Arabic astrological medicine, and this tradition is very well known and filters down into the Latin world via Constantine the African, whose medical compendium, the Pantagni, is for the most part a translation of the Kitab al-Maliki by al-Maghouzi, so the royal book by al-Maghouzi. The planets, which month after month in this tradition exert their influence on the embryo and then on the fetus, according to this line, are in order Saturn, Jupiter, so the second would be Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, and then again, because the planets are only 7 according to them, again Saturn on the 8th month and Jupiter for the 9th month. In this case, then the heaven that would dominate the embryo would be in the 2nd month Jupiter, to which nobility is usually attributed. This interpretation is perhaps not the most immediate. I'm aware of this, not least for the simple fact that 2nd heaven should be intended in Cecco's verses as a contracted expression for heaven that presides over the 2nd month of the gestation of the child. This does not take away from the fact, though, that in this embryological chapter, Cecco decisively adopts the thesis of a succession of planetary influences on the unborn child, as we might clearly read in the next slide. Ideally, here the poetry is a bit lost in translation. However, ideally, births occur in the 9th month when Jupiter exercises full influence. But babies born at 7 months can live because the moon is powerful at that time and rains down its beneficence on humans, thus assisting nature in every possible ways. And this is a very awkward feature of this tradition. So, of course, Jupiter in month number 9, the qualities of Jupiter are the qualities for life: humidity, moistness, and heat and moisture. And the most of the babies born at month number 9 survive. Some babies born at month number 7 often survived, even back then in the Middle Ages, because of the benevolent influence of the moon. But very peculiar to this tradition, as you might know, is that next slide, babies born at month number 8 die, most often die, because that's when Saturn reigns. Its coldness and dryness, also the qualities of Saturn, takes the spirit from their hearts. Every month is ruled by a particular planet until the expected birth of the baby occurs. So we can clearly understand that Cecco was well aware of this tradition, and that's why he possibly accorded to the 2nd heaven, the planet of nobility, the main role, by meaning with 2nd sphere or 2nd heaven Jupiter and not Mercury. But Cecco's embryology is distinguished from Dante's not only by the different weight given to the astral component. The way in which Cecco describes the reproductive process includes, next slide, a series of elements that are more typical of physicians than of philosophers. And here they are. So the existence of a double seed, this is clearly a medical feature. Then we might discuss, of course, the female seed is not as powerful, as formative, as good as the male seed, but still here we have a clear reference to the existence of a double seed, and this is a medical feature. Then the idea of that the greater resemblance to the father or to the mother depends precisely on the prevalence of one or the other seed, just like Hippocrates said. Then the possible role of maternal imagination, I mean, the stressing of the role of maternal imagination is also a very medical feature, more medical. And the belief that the uterus consists of 7 cells is also a medical feature. Of course, we know that this theory of the 7 chambers of the uterus was a pseudo-Galenic theory, was not a genuine theory by Galen, but still the spermate, the work where this theory was expressed in a very strong way, was a bestseller of the medieval medical milieu. And last but not least, the possibility of superfetation, because we have to go back to twins. The last 2 theses deserve special attention because they are called into play to explain the possibility of twin or multiple births. Cecco has no hesitation in including in his astrological medicine the anatomical thesis, the pseudo-Galenic thesis of the partition of the uterus into 7 cells, with each uterine cell corresponding to a particular planet. And we can go to the next text. The reference is so clear that it's, but what we maybe we read it very quickly. A woman's uterus has 7 chambers, 1 for each planet, which means that she can give birth to 7 children. And also in the next slide, we can find other medical theories. The superfetation theory, it's a very dangerous theory. Cecco admits the possibility that the mother can give birth to 2 twins as a consequence of a second coupling when she was already pregnant with the first embryo. Cecco refers to a case here of which he had a direct experience. This is also a feature, peculiarly medical feature. The case of Lisa del Lago. When a woman conceives, she contracts her uterus neck so that not even at the point of a needle of a pin, also Avicenna this is a clear reference to Avicenna, to me, Avicenna's canon. The thing is that what happened here, we can also read the next text. So superfetation means exactly this, that one woman can give birth to 2 children or 2 twins because of this reopening of her womb and because of a second sexual intercourse. Clearly, continues Cecco, one twin was born at 9 months, the other at 10, which proves that they were conceived separately. So the last lines are are not that striking per se, but the thing is that what strikes me is that, of course, superfetation was already admitted both by Aristotle and in the Hippocratic corpus, but then in antiquity was considered to be a very rare occurrence among humans due to an anatomical weakness of the neck of the womb, but there was no moral stigma connected to the superfecundated woman. The misogynistic tinge that the doctrine progressively assumes in the Middle Ages instead is very evident, at least here in Cecco. Although the right translation would be not of the last line, not precisely at the moment of her hottest love, but when the woman decides to have another sexual intercourse. However, it is precisely the reference to these parallel or overlapping explanations of the origin of twin births that bring us back to the question of nobility, and to the next slide that we read already. Dante wrote to me expressing doubt. This is the slide we already read. There are two twins, one is nobler than the other. What do you think about this event? And as I said before, it is unlikely that Dante ever wrote this missive to Cecco. But in any case, Cecco's answer in the next slide is still substantially monocausal and relies on the diversity of astral influences alone, even in the case of twin births. I replied to Dante, readers pay attention. The heavens influence us in different ways according to the philosopher we both admire, that is Aristotle, causing the appearance of different qualities. In one conception there can be various effects, in un concetto variati effetti, depending on the way the souls are animated. So the firstborn, in the text goes on, the firstborn develops, goes on in the next slide, develops under eastern stars, while the other child, through divine power, is influenced by constellations in the west. If the first is virtuous, but the other base, it's due to favorable planetary conditions. The evil twin still looks like him, though no, it would be simply and on the contrary, other influences can be evil influences that is different from the first ones, not simile. However, the argument about twins had already been used since antiquity in an anti-astrological key. How is it possible that two individuals conceived and generated at the same time have, in the course of their lives, so radically different fates? This is an argument by, for example, Cicero, but also Augustine. Cecco seems, at least implicitly, to align himself with one of the classical counter-arguments of the supporters of the validity of astrology. He was an astrologer. The celestial movements are so rapid as to mark a profound difference even in twins. Indeed, the position of the twins within the womb, even if only slightly different, is sufficient to make them fall under different astral influences. And this is also true for Dante in a way. For the later Dante, the Dante of the comedy, he will take up in Paradise 8 the idea that individual differences can be traced back, even if only in part, to the influence of the stars. And we can see that in the next quotation. We are nearly at the end of Dante Paradise 8. Revolving nature serving as a seal for mortal walks plies well its art, but it does not distinguish one house from another. Thus, and this is a reference to the most famous twins couple ever, maybe the biblical couple of Jacob and Esau. Even from the seed, Esau takes leave of Jacob. To sum up, but then you see that's okay, astral influences up to a point, because on top of that there is the divine provision, divine providence intervenes. So to sum up, Dante and Cecco come to similar conclusions. That is, the influences of stars do not produce perfectly identical effects, even in the case of twins. And they use this discourse to speak, to talk of nobility in a broader sense. However, the way in which they come to these conclusions is on closer inspection, profoundly different, because for Cecco, it is the heavens themselves that produce the differences, even in twins. For Dante, these differences in the generative process are instead the result of an alteration in the regularity of celestial influences, which are there, but which are but there is an alteration which is desired or foreseen by the divine will. Thus, it is not contradictory or even surprising that in Paradise 32, next slide, Jacob and Esau are trotted out as they had been by Augustine to show the unfathomability of predestination and divine judgment. Dante recourse to twin is double-edged. On the one hand, one could say in a natural way, using the terminology of the Banquet, the convivio, that it serves to justify the production of individual differences that in some way escape the regularity of the celestial motions or that exceed it. But one could also, in a theological way, point out that twins show that even further upstream, the infusion of divine grace responds to criteria that remain inaccessible to us, to human reason, and that precede any merit and any human agency. So in this talk, I've tried to add two illustrious names to the list of those who, in the Middle Ages, resorted to twins in elaborating their positions on individual differences, in this case in relation to nobility, Dante Alighieri and Cecco d'Ascoli. Both believed that independently of belonging to the same family, and indeed independently of having the same parents, and that's why the twins are a good example, one twin may be noble and the other not, or that one might be more noble than the other. The conclusion is founded on embryological principle, which, however, as I hope I've been able to show, are in reality very different. An Aristotelian embryology on one side, Dante's side, a philosophical embryology, we might say, and a medical embryology for Cecco. Cecco, if only because of his training, medical training and profession, makes use of notions that belong more properly to the medical tradition. The thesis of the double seed, the thesis of the 7 cells of the womb, also astrological, medical astrological organogenesis, and superfetation. I guess, therefore, that this subject, nobility, and the example of twins used to treat this subject is can be seen as another point of confrontation, not only between philosophy and medicine, but also between philosophy and astrology, if we consider the strongly astrological approach to medicine in Cecco. To conclude, I'm stressing once again how twins confirm here their function as a privileged epistemological laboratory. They justify the use of the example of twins, justify the production of individual differences starting from natural conditions that are, at least apparently, perfectly identical. In un concetto, variati effetti, as Cecco puts it in verse. Thank you very much for your attention.